There were some great metal albums in 2020, but there were also some albums that I just didn't want to buy, for one reason or another. So in this video, I'm going to go through 9 vinyl releases that fit that bill, and explain why I passed on each one of them. Some of these albums were actually kind of popular. So with that, let's get into some trouble. So before I get to this list, I'm going to potentially warn you that I'm going to say some not very nice things about albums that you might potentially like a whole lot. And that's okay. I mean, that's how taste works, and that's how opinion works. So know that going in, that that's exactly what I'm doing, and save me a whole bunch of hassle in the comments. But anywho, my general reason for avoiding these albums is basically they're either albums I just didn't like at all, or maybe I was just bored with the album, or the album had more songs I hated than liked. And I've got to prioritize my vinyl purchasing. As many of you know, vinyl is kind of pricey. We have a rather expensive little hobby, you and I, so I have to prioritize. And some albums just don't make the cut. And these are 9 of them. Also, I'm going to go through these albums in the order they were released, just because. All right, let's get to it. Starting with the 17th studio album from Annihilator, this is Ballistic Sadistic, came out January 24th, 2020. The thing about the Jeff Waters band, and I'm going to call it that, is that there are a lot of components here that should make a great metal album. You've got great riffs, you've got great talent. I mean, Jeff Waters is kind of both. He's a great guitar player. He writes decent songs, at least in the past he did. You know, we have Alice in Hell, we have Never Neverland, 2 really incredible albums, or also the 2 earliest albums, back in the late 80s and early 90s. But this album, again, I think a lot of the components are there, but they just don't stitch together to make a really good metal album for me. They just sound like parts thrown together. And I think the other thing, of course, is that Annihilator has gone through a lot of lineup changes. Like a lot of lineup changes. You know, they had 7 singers, they had 6 guitar players, they had 9 bass players, they had 11 drummers. If you do the math, that's 33 musicians. That rivals Spinal Tap. Also, I'm not too fond of Jeff Waters on vocals. I think maybe he should get back one of the 7 singers of the past. Where's Coburn Farr these days? Actually, I kind of know. I know recently Jeff and Coburn have been talking about retouring Never Neverland, the anniversary of that album, here in 2021. You know, if shows happen in 2021. But yeah, Jeff's voice, it's serviceable, but it's also kind of predictable, and it just doesn't do a lot for me. Also, the lyrics on this album are pretty dumb, like astoundingly dumb in parts. The attitude is the epitome of that. Can't get past it some of the time. Also, the songs are kind of samey. Barring the riffs, some of the riffs I should say, there's a lot of sameness going on in this record. So yeah, it's just parts stitched together. It doesn't make songs for me, so I'm not really into this album. If you are, good on you. Maybe you're just loving riffs, riff after riff, and that's a thing for you. And that's great, but it's just not me. Now, do I think this is a bad album? Not exactly, but is it an album I'm going to buy? No. Next up is the 12th studio album for Ozzy Osbourne. This is Ordinary Man, released February 21st, 2020. And right away, I'm reminded that Ozzy probably should have packed it in years ago. I think there are a number of legacy artists that should have done that. My favorite band comes to mind. Yeah, Kiss should have probably said, that's it, a long time ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago even. I think Ozzy has that as well. Is there one more album left in the guy? Who knows? I can't imagine there is. But this album is not going out on a high point, to be honest. The whole album is overproduced, it's overpolished, it's poppy at times, it's boring most of the time. I mean, it's really passionless, it's really insincere. I think the glory days are gone, and this record shows it in spades. We're also doing a lot on this album to desperately cover up the fact that Ozzy is well beyond his prime as a vocalist. Even though Ozzy was never really a great singer, let's be honest here. And I think another failure of this album is the fact that there is no great guitarist here. I mean, Ozzy has leaned on great guitar players in the past. I mean, he's relied on them, sometimes over-relied on them. You know, we had Randy Rhoads, we had Jakey Lee, we had Zakk Wylde. Where are guitar players like that on this album? They're not here. And once you take those out of the picture, you're left noticing that the album's material is way worse than you thought it would be. And yeah, Elton John and Post Malone on this album don't help matters either. I'm not sure what the thought process was behind having those artists here. You know, you have this metal icon, and I don't know, as a fan of you, listening to this album and going, you know what Ozzy's music needs is the Rocket Man. No metal fan is thinking that whatsoever, so I don't know why they're here. So yeah, I'm glad I saved my money on this one. Yeah. Next up is the debut album from BPMD. This is American Made, released on June 12th, 2020. I'll tell you, I really wanted to like this album. I mean, it has some musicians on it that I think quite a bit about. Blitz from Overkill being the big one. I mean, I'm a huge Overkill fan, and I really enjoyed Dee Dee Verney's solo project. I thought that was a great album. It wasn't Overkill, but it didn't need to be. Really enjoyed that, so I thought to myself, hey, you know, Blitz is doing this project over here as well. Maybe I'll like it just as much. But guess what? No chance. And speaking of Blitz, I don't think his voice works with all of these cover songs. Yes, American Made is an album full of cover songs. You know, because we needed one more of those albums these days. No, we don't. I'm also not excited about the choices in cover songs here. Maybe it's a generational thing. There's a lot of 70s rock songs here that I'm just not into. So maybe that's part of my not liking of this album very much. Maybe. I'll admit it. Now, certainly there's a wealth of talent on this album, no denying that, but given the uninteresting song choices and Blitz's voice not fitting this material, and let's be honest here, the performances are really not high energy exactly, I definitely passed on this album for more than a few reasons. Next up is the 16th studio album for Napalm Death. This is Throes of Joy in the Jaws of Defeatism. Came out September 18th, 2020. My opinion of grindcore has really changed over the decades. I think back in the late 80s and the early 90s during the whole earache scene, I was definitely into it, quite a bit into it. Maybe that was just a kid thing, though. I don't know. As I've grown older, grindcore has kind of fallen by the wayside. I could kind of take it or leave it now. So I think that factors into my receptivity or lack of receptivity to modern Napalm Death. Of course, that also means that my favorite Napalm Death was the death metal period for them, back in the early 90s. Harmony Corruption is the Napalm Death album for me. I always enjoyed that sound from them and kind of mourned when it went away and they went back to grindcore. And I think it's fair to say that I don't share this band's political views at all. But I don't necessarily need to with a band. A band can believe what they want and think what they want and say what they want. As long as the music's there, I don't always care about the lyrics. But in this case, it's both. Now, there are bands whose beliefs I don't agree with, but I like their music. And this is where I'm going to mention the fact that I recently bought a Stryper album. That's right, Stryper. I'll be talking about that in the next vinyl haul, so get ready for that. You know, I could probably be fine with this album if it was just merely background music instead of actively listening to it. Like if I had chores around the house, I could just put it on, but do I really want to spend all the money to buy the vinyl version of an album that's really going to just blend in the background? I don't think so. Next up is the 8th studio album for Armored Saint. This is Punching the Sky, released on October 23rd, 2020. And I'll tell you, I really wanted to love this album. I loved Armored Saint's classic era, the 80s and early 90s stuff, even Symbol of Salvation, which was a relatively commercial release for them. I was kind of okay with them moving into the times a little bit. But this album, I don't know. I just didn't dig it as much. I'll also admit here that I really don't know a lot of the Armored Saint post-Symbol of Salvation. Maybe this newest album is a lot like those other albums. Maybe they just changed their sound and that's where they are right now. Not really sure. One thing I noticed on this record, though, there's kind of a 90s alt-rock vibe going on here. I don't know if you hear it, but I definitely hear it. And I'm not much into that sound. I wasn't back then. I'm certainly not now. So that's there. Also, the heaviness is kind of gone in a lot of ways. Maybe as a result of that, I think they've gone a little bit mellow here, more often than not. So that's also lacking here as well for me. I think what also happened is there was a lot of hype behind this album. A lot of people in the vinyl community love this album. Some people put that in the top 10 list of 2020, which is fine. Certainly wasn't in mine. But I just don't feel that it's the masterpiece that everyone was making it out to be. And again, I think my expectations were set pretty high, but even aside from that, I don't know. It's just not as solid of an album for me as I wanted it to be. Next up is the 3rd studio album for Evil Dead. This is United States of Anarchy, released October 30th, 2020. And I know this isn't going to sound fair at all, but I gotta say it, this really doesn't measure up to their early material, their classic material. As many know, Evil Dead had in this amazing album that came out in 1989 called Annihilation of Civilization. Incredible thrash album. And this material doesn't even come close to measuring up to it. Not even close. And the funny thing about this is that this is the classic lineup of the band. It even includes guitarist Juan Garcia, who you might know from that one Abattoir album, but he was also in Agent Steel, great guitar player. So some of this isn't making a whole lot of sense to me. One of the things that really does bug me on this album is that the vocal patterns are totally generic and unimaginative. You get a whole lot of that whole like staccato vocal thing that plagued the thrash metal genre back in its early days too. A lot of the cookie cutter bands had that going. It seems to be happening here as well. I think the lyrics and the vocals on past albums, we'll bring that up again, were far more brutal, far more aggressive, far more energetic. Not hearing a thing like that on this record. Songs on here also sound a bit samey, and as a result, nothing is really memorable here. Now, is the album terrible? I wouldn't say it is, but they could have definitely stepped it up in terms of punch and delivery. Those qualities they had on their previous albums, I would have liked to have seen that a little bit more, but there just isn't that energy. There isn't that aggression. There isn't that oomph that I really enjoyed back in the classic era. So that's why I didn't buy it. Next up is the 13th studio album for Fate's Warning. This is Long Day Goodnight. Came out November 6th, 2020. And, you know, I gotta say it, despite the fact that this band is full of really talented musicians, I mean extremely talented, this band is basically a prog pop band now. And this album shows that. This album is really mellow in parts, actually in many parts, and very mellow, might I add. I mean like AM radio station soft rock mellow. And that's kind of strange when you think about past efforts. And yeah, I'm going to be that old guy and name past efforts again. Because there were great albums. I mean, The Spectre Within and No Exit and even Perfect Symmetry and Parallels. Love those albums. Yeah, this is prog pop. That's what it is. So this is definitely more about a band that I'm no longer interested in because of their sound change, more than it being a bad album. Because it might not be a bad album. I know this band has a lot of devoted fans. Some of them might really love the crap out of this album. In fact, if you're one of them, let me know in the comments and why. But yeah, I just didn't come along with the sound change, so I'm not interested. Next up is the 17th studio album for AC/DC. This is Power Up, released November 13th, 2020. And like at least one other album I talked about, I really wanted to like this album a lot. I mean, I have a big history with AC/DC going back to the early 1980s. I have a lot of memories and experiences associated with their music, which would make you think that I'd be the perfect candidate to love Power Up. But I'm just not. And it does remind me of something. I really believe this is a group of AC/DC fans that are wholly connected to this band simply out of nostalgia. They too had great experiences and great memories associated with this music. So I think they're kind of hanger-ons in a lot of ways, and they probably just mindlessly praise this album as yet another great AC/DC album, when I just don't buy it. One thing that bugs me about these tracks is that they really feel phoned in by comparison to their earlier efforts. They're much earlier efforts, let's be honest. There's not a lot of punch to the delivery here. And yeah, they do sound similar, but let's be honest here. AC/DC has pretty much made a career out of sounding samey. So I'm not really complaining about that. It's more about the delivery and the punch and the lack of it. See, my main complaint about this album is it simply has no balls. I mean, it's well produced, it's well played, the production's okay, but it just doesn't get me amped or psyched or whatever the hell you kids say these days. Next up is the debut album for Elfson. This is No Cover, released November 20th, 2020. And as the title says, or doesn't say, this is a Cover Tunes album, yet another one, of course. This one is a mixed bag, though. I don't hate it entirely. There are some great songs on it. I think Jason McMaster's singing Free Will Burning as the opener, the Judas Priest song. He blows the lid off that song. It's amazing. Also, his cover of Eat the Rich from Crocus is pretty decent, but the album just doesn't keep that momentum up at all. And some of the song choices are a bit of a head scratcher. I mean, Rebel Yell is just stupid and cringy. They also do Auf Wiedersehen, the Cheap Trick song, which is interesting, I guess, in theory. I mean, I love Cheap Trick, but hearing Al Jorgensen of Ministry sing it in his stupid, overprocessed voice just doesn't work at all. I think like with a lot of these failed cover tunes ideas, and I'm calling them failed, you can call them successes if you want. The big thing with me is that I'm constantly reminded about how great the originals are, how much greater the originals are than these versions. Like a lot better. Like a lot better. So it's slightly better than BPMD's cover tunes album, but not by a lot. So yeah, I passed on it. And those were the metal albums I didn't buy in 2020. Of course, I know some of you enjoyed these albums. Some of you are pretty fond of them. You should let me know in the comments which ones they are and why you like them so much, because I am actually interested in other people's opinions. Also, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see me do this every year. I'm sure there'll be plenty of albums in future years that don't make the cut for me in 2022 and 2023 and so on. So yeah, definitely let me know in the comments if that's of interest to you. Of course, if you like this video, you know what to do. It looks like that. Also, subscribe if you haven't already done so. Share the video with your friends. This is the Accusation Network. I do metal vinyl collecting videos each and every week. Sometimes once, sometimes twice. You never know. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and ever forward.